Welcome everyone. Today we have Robert Charpentier, Communications Specialist, who is behind the camera, and Chuck Eagles, Tumwa's very own Water Conservation Coordinator and expert, who will talk to you about winterizing your sprinkler system. During the session, if you have any questions, you may either raise your hand to let us know you'd like to speak, or write your questions or comments in either the Q&A or chat fields. I will be monitoring these as the presentation goes along, and we'll address them at the appropriate times. For those of you using Zoom for the first time, the Q&A and chat will be at the bottom of your screen. For anyone who is joining us via telephone, if you wish to speak, press *9 to raise your hand and let me know. Chuck, if you're ready, you may begin. Thank you.
Chuck Swiggles here. I'm the Water Conservation Coordinator with Truckee Meadows Water Authority. This is the fourth and final fall virtual workshop in a series titled Irrigation Winterization, or Prevent Water Loss and Protect Your Property from Hard Freeze Events. Next page, Sonia. This is an actual real-life picture. Somebody had a pretty significant water leak. It looks pretty cool, but I believe it did some damage to their irrigation system. Our goal today is to protect your irrigation system against winter. This information could help you avoid costly damage to your property. Next slide, please. Okay, these are some things that we want to familiarize yourself with. We want to locate and identify what these are. The first column are valves or sleeves that would be underground. Those are about 4 or 5 inch in diameter, like a PVC or plastic material. They actually allow access to the water valves and the drain valve that are buried in the ground anywhere from 2, 3, maybe 4 feet down. They typically will have a cap on the top, but that's going to kind of look what they look like. The next slide, these are more at the surface level. These are the plastic or fiberglass, usually a green box with a green lid, kind of an oblong shape. The lid just pops right up, and these are your sprinkler valves that actually control the flow, the on and off function of lawn sprinklers, drip irrigation. You may have one, you may have two, you may have more depending upon the size of your property. You could have a separate box for the front yard, a separate box for the backyard. So you want to identify where these are located. Next column, we have the backflow device, and we'll be getting into how to winterize this in more detail. Essentially, the backflow is a device that prevents tainted irrigation water, because think about this. Water may sit out in your sprinkler lines and your drip lines for 2, 3, 4 days, developing bacteria. It's a natural event. Let's say you lose pressure in your home or in the system. Well, this device will prevent that tainted water from getting back into where all the clean water is. So it's a good thing to have, but we do need to protect it. Last but not least, we have the irrigation timer box or control system timer, whatever you want to call it. This is kind of what they look like. They're typically located in the garage on a wall. Some may be inside the home in a closet. There are a few you may see on the outside of the house, hopefully in a protected area. I call this the brain of the irrigation system because it sends an electronic signal to the sprinkler valves that are in the boxes that are at ground level, telling your sprinklers when to turn on and off, how long they should run for, and you're able to set all this at the timer. We'll get into how to take care of that as well, but that's kind of what they look like. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, these are some tools and items and terms to know that you want to be familiar with. First and foremost, the sprinkler key. It's kind of a chrome color. It's got a handle at the top and notch down at the bottom. These are designed for more of what they call a globe valve. It's got a star or a cross top. It's not a real heavy duty material, but it will allow you to turn those types of valves. Could be an on and off valve and drain valve. The other key with the red handles, it's a much heavier duty. A slot valve is designed more for a ball valve or what we call a stop and waste valve. It's got a slot at the bottom. Coincidentally, these will usually fit on the Truckee Meadows Water Authority cutoff valve on the street side of the meter in an emergency. Good tool to have, but you may need one of these. You may need both. In the middle, you have a small little flathead screwdriver. These are to open up the test cocks and the backflow. Nothing fancy. It's a good tool to have laying around. Most households will have them, but we'll get into that a little bit more as well. On the upper right-hand corner, it's just a single handle ball valve. All it does is either allow water to pass through the piping, or it will stop the water by turning the valve. Usually if that handle's in line with the pipe, it's open. If it's crossways, that's typically closed. Down below with the blue handles, those are typical valves on the backflow, on the up and down pipe or the sideways pipe. As you see them now in this diagram, that is in the open position. And then you have the test cocks. That's what the slots or the flathead screwdriver is for. These will need to be opened up when we winterize the backflow, which we will get to here. Okay, next slide. Okay, we'll take a look at some real life stuff here. First and foremost, very simple. Flathead screwdriver, not real big, not too small, but actually fits into the test cock valve here. Plenty of wiggle room there, you're good to go. You'll find lots of uses for these around the house. Here is the typical sprinkler key. This is the cross top valve. It'll turn these fairly easily. If you get into a heavier duty type valve, like a ball valve here, what will happen if you try and manipulate this valve with this type of key, this will just bend. So that's where it comes into play with having a heavier duty key. Much stouter material. That just fits right on the top of the valve when you just turn it one way or the other. Also, these are good to have around in an emergency. This is a Truckee Meadows Water Authority or TMWA meter. This is the actual angle stop or the cutoff valve that is on the street side of the meter. And we'll describe this a little bit more later on here, but you can actually turn off your valve in an emergency to cut complete water off to your residence, irrigation, everything. We will certainly come out and do this for you, but some people like to have these handy just in case we need them. Okay, next slide. Okay, first thing we'd like to do, and this is an optional thing, is to take a look at your meter to make sure there is no water going through your system, no leaks. This is a actual representation of one type of meter we have out there. To the left of center, now you see the long red dial. This goes clockwise, or to the right will actually measure gallons. That's what those numbers are. To the left of center, you have what is called the low flow indicator, or we call it LFI for short. It's a spiked little dial that will turn when there's water going through the meter. It's very sensitive to water movement. In fact, on most residential meters, one full turn of that is only a 20th of a gallon. So it'll pick up a dripping faucet real slowly somewhere. The nice thing about this, if you know it's dead still, if it's not moving, before you start the winterization process, you're good. If you do see some movement there, turning slightly or a lot, Make sure there's no faucets running, accidentally left on. Make sure there's nobody in the house using water. Make sure that faucets are off. It could be something very simple that's causing that to move. But I would always check that before you start the winterization process. That way you know if you've done a good job or successful job in shutting the irrigation down. Okay. This is a cross diagram of a typical meter in the ground. You can see the surface level where the grass is. You'll see a lid that can be either round, maybe 18, 20 inches in diameter or across. You'll see rectangular shaped lids, square lids. Sometimes your meter pit in front of the house, usually they're close to the sidewalk or street area. There may be 2 meters, one for you and one for your neighbor, depending on the configuration. Usually below the lid, there's an insulator, helps keep that meter from freezing up in the cold, cold winters. You'll have the meter and you'll have the actual dial on top, and the rest of it down below is just the water coming in from the main line, usually in the street, and then going into your home, the service line. That's just an example cross view of what it would look like. Okay, next slide. Okay. Now this is a separate component. As you can see by the full body of the meter here, you have the dials and you have the actual meter itself. Well, we're going to use just the dials for representation. It's a little easier to look at it, but they are 2 distinct components. Here's the low flow indicator on the meter. That's what it's really going to look like. Now, of course, this is not hooked up to function. So of course it's dead still, it's not moving, but that's what it should look like before you start the winterization process. So you know that there's no water going through. We also have some digital meters out there. We have a variation of them. As you can see, the digital numbers, if there was any kind of leak or water going through, you'll see a small symbol at the bottom. It's kind of like a star or snowflake that will either be on or will flash on. Also, these meters read down to 1/100th of a gallon. So you may see some numbers change very, very slowly. Word of note here, and that is some of these meters have a battery saving feature because they do send out the meter read electronically. Well, if somebody comes along and opens it and forgets to close it, it'll actually shut the screen down. It doesn't change the settings or the read or any of the numbers. It just turns off the actual display to save on the battery life. All you have to do is close it for a couple of seconds and open it back up. And there you go. And if anybody ever needs any help, if they're not sure what they're looking at or how to read the meter, how to safely access it, where it's located, always feel free to call us here in Conservation at the 834-8005 number. We're always happy to help. Many times we can help you over the phone. If necessary, to make a field visit and go over this with you, we're happy to do that as well. Next slide, Sonia. Okay. You have the main valve or the main supply valve, which supplies the water. Usually it's going to be right next to a drain valve. You may have more than one drain valve. You could have a couple of different drain valves. You might even also have what we call a house valve. It's a separate supply valve or shutoff valve to the house itself. So depending on how your system was configured, you could have anywhere from 2 sleeves on it to 4. Very rarely you see more than that. But the idea is to be able to isolate the house, be able to isolate the irrigation, drain off the water from the irrigation. And again, they're going to have the caps And again, as it says down at the bottom, they're approximately 3 to 4 feet into the ground. I've seen them shallower. I've seen them a little bit deeper, but that's a pretty good guesstimate. Don't be afraid to take a peek down there with a flashlight, see what you're dealing with. If there's a lot of debris, dirt, leaves, or whatever, if you have a shop vac, it's a great way to clean those out. Even if you have to dump a little water to kind of soften things up, that's what a shop vac is for. So it's a good way to clean them out. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, first off, we want to shut down the supply valve with an irrigation key. What is a really good idea is you see in the figure, you have a flashlight that is taped onto the key about midway. It can be a little lower, a little higher, but the idea is you get light down there so you see where you're putting that key. You're able to get it onto the valve, not fumbling around with it. It's a lot easier than holding a flashlight in one hand and trying to manipulate the key onto the valve with the other. What you do to turn that off is you turn it to the right or turn it clockwise. Depending on the type of valve, it may only turn maybe a quarter of the turn. When it stops, just make sure it's snug. Don't over tighten it because you can break these valves if you really get ambitious. Or it could be a different type of valve where it continues to spin several turns, but if you're careful, you'll feel it when it stops. Just snug it down, don't over tighten it, and you'll be good to go there. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is one, possibly you may have a couple of these of the drain valves, and the idea is to open these up fully and let water drain as much as it can from the system. Same thing, if you have the same key for this particular valve, great. You may need to put a flashlight on the other type of key if you need to, but on the drain valve, you open it by turning it to the left or counterclockwise, and you'll feel it when it stops, and then maybe back it off just a little bit, so you're not putting any pressure on the washers in there, and you'll see some water probably come out of that valve. It may start filling up the sleeve, but if that water dissipates, you're okay. If it continues to fill the sleeve and maybe overflow, you may not have the actual supply valve turned off all the way. But if there is water down there, it will dissipate away, will drain off. Down in the lower right-hand corner, this is one of the irrigation control boxes with the sprinkler valves. Many times you will have a separate drain valve in there. And what it is, it'll just be a normal type of valve. And on the, what we call the downstream side of it, it'll just have an opening, maybe a small, short little pipe coming out that doesn't lead to anywhere. It's just opened up. Well, that's the drain valve. When you open that up, you should have water. It may not be a lot of water, but it could be enough water to cause freeze damage. Should flow out of there, and open that up and leave it open. Okay, next slide. This is a common residential backflow. Again, we talked about this protecting the water supply, from irrigation water. Not everybody's going to have a backflow. Now, they are required for commercial and businesses regardless, but not all residential homes, and maybe an older home. Usually if a home is built within the last 20 years or so, you should see one of these on the outside. They may have metal piping, but quite commonly the piping coming out of the ground is PVC or a plastic. Okay, next slide. Okay, we're actually going to do a live demonstration on this also, but what you want to do is the two flat handled valves that are in line with the pipes, the top pipe and the lower pipe, is turn those to the right so they're 90 degrees, so they're going across the actual pipe. Now, the position that shows now is they're open. By turning them across the pipe, we'll close them off. Then you take your flathead screwdriver in that test cock. You can see where the screwdriver is. You can see that little slot. It doesn't matter if you turn it right or left. It's not going to go anywhere. Inside there's a little ball with a hole in it. And when you open it up, you can actually see the hole in the ball valve. Be careful if there is any water pressure in there that you don't stick your eye or your face in front of that, because it can sting you pretty good. But what you do is you turn that slot so it's in line with the actual test cock or the pipe, just like the other ones that are in line in this diagram. You'll see water trickle out, not a lot, but you will see a little bit of water come out of there. Leave them open. You definitely want those open throughout the winter to allow any moisture to escape. Once you're done with that process, take your flat angle valves on the two pipes, the one going across, the one going up and down, and turn them to a 45-degree angle. So what is that? That's halfway between the way they are now and halfway between in the closed position. What that'll do, that'll allow water to dissipate or make its way out of any nooks and crannies in that ball area that may be trapped. Also, it's kind of a universal symbol that if anybody's looking at your system, a landscaper, the water authority, anybody wants to know if you're winterized or not, it's kind of a universal sign that yes, you've been winterized and have taken care of it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. Excuse this top valve here. It's a little bit stuck in there, but all we're doing here is your backflow. This is all metal pipe. Everything above my fingers on the backflow is going to be above ground. All the rest of this stuff is underground. As you remember, the valves, like this has two drain valves. Those are down at the bottom of those sleeves. This is a condensed version of what you may see. That's why it looks the way it does. All we do is we turn these to the right. That's off. Turn this to the right. Okay, so both of these are off. Take your flathead screwdriver. And these are already open, but that's closed. You can see the flathead. That's open. This one is already open. It should have been closed, but it's open now. And you would see a little bit of water dribble out of there. Leave these open. Don't close them up. You want to have a place for water to escape. So then we just take the angle valves, turn them about a 45 degree. Doesn't have to be perfect, but close enough. What that's going to do, it's going to allow any residual water to come out of there, any residual water like in the ball valve mechanism inside of the piping escape. Plus it tells us that you have winterized, so you're good to go. It's as simple as that. One thing customers also do, you have union valves here. Many people, and that's what these are designed for, they just loosen them up. This will separate from the pipe in the ground and the backflow. You just pull it up, make sure there's no water in it, put it in your garage, and you don't have to worry about it freezing. And if you do that, make sure these pipes coming out of the ground are either capped off or covered so you don't get debris, you don't get bugs. You want to keep it kind of sterile because when you start everything up in the springtime, you don't want a bunch of debris clogging stuff up here. But that's another way to avoid freeze in the backflow because these are usually at least $100 or so at your plumbing supply. So they're not cheap. You don't want to be replacing this every year if you don't have to. Okay. Okay, what do we got next, Sonia?
We're ready for questions, Chuck. And I don't have any questions at the moment. Members of the public, the attendees, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, Chuck, we have an attendee who would like to ask a question. Dan. Dan, I just allowed you to speak if you wanted to unmute yourself.
Can you repeat that, Robert? I couldn't hear.
Hi,
Yes,
Dan. We can hear you. Chuck, can you hear him?
No, I can't.
Dan, I can't hear you. Are you speaking, Dan? Okay. Dan, we'll try to come back to you when I see that your microphone is working. James is next to speak. Chuck, James, I just allowed you to speak. You wanted to unmute yourself, James?
Hello.
There we go. Hi, James. Welcome. What's your question? Yes.
Oh, hi. My question was regarding the drain valves. Looks like there's like a main valve, the two valves that were like 3 to 4 feet below ground. How do you know which is the main valve and which is the drain valve?
Okay, good question.
Great question, James. With any luck, the riser tubes or the tubes coming out of the ground have been marked. Quite often, even if they have been, the marker will fade away and you just don't know. So it's kind of a process of elimination. What you can do is just start turning valves. You don't have to turn them all the way, but if you suspect one might be the drain and one or the other is open all the way, you can tell by getting in there with your key. And if it feels like one valve is open, that's probably the supply valve, and the other one is probably the drain valve. And the way to double check that is to take your key and slightly open the drain valve that you suspect. And if all of a sudden water starts coming out, well, you know that's the drain valve now. So it's just a process of elimination. Just play around with it, turn the valves a little bit, and I think you'll be able to figure it out once you get down there and start turning valves.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Good idea is to mark, if you're able to, the inside of the riser sleeves of what is what. Don't mark the caps because those caps get mixed around. But if you mark the inside of the sleeve, there's less chance of those markings being faded out or disappearing, and that way you won't have that issue going forward.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, James. I have another question here from Dan. He typed it in since he's having some issues with his microphone. The drain portion of the system will drain based on gravity. Will water in the system under the yard slowly flow backward? Because you can't get all of the water out, correct?
Well, the way most systems are designed, what we're doing here is a representation of many systems out there. Now, there could be some idiosyncrasies with yours that's causing some water to backflow. But this should eliminate all the water from the backflow, from the valves at the ground level. I suspect you're talking about the peripheral lines that go from the sprinkler valves out to the sprinkler heads, maybe the drip system. It's going to get to a point where it's going to stop, but if it's fairly shallow, it does not hurt to blow out the system with a compressor. I do that to mine at home because I do know of some lines that are fairly shallow. All the water doesn't come out, but enough does. So if I do get a really hard freeze, it's not going to be enough to expand and break the lines. Word of caution is if you do blow out the system, keep in mind that most air compressors develop some pretty high pressure and you don't want to start breaking your valves or blowing out other components by using too much pressure, but just enough to get that water out of there so it doesn't freeze up and expand. Does that help?
I don't have any follow-up questions from Dan at the moment. He could be typing if he has follow-up questions. Anybody else have a question or comment? Okay.
A couple more things I'd like to do here, Sonia, since
Yeah.
we're on the live portion of this, is once you've winterized, go back to your meter.
Before you start, Chuck, sorry. Dan followed up with that their set regulator is 20 PSI.
Say that again.
The set regulator is 20 PSI.
For what?
For the explanation you just gave regarding the system draining.
Probably on his air compressor.
Yeah, that's.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, you know, a lot of times the water pressure in the water system can be much more than that. But if it's set 20, I set mine for no more than about 70 PSI. Kind of a small tank, and it's a little bit painful to go through it. But, you know, I think when you start getting up over 60, 70 PSI, you're really asking for trouble. And then if you get down too low, you may have a tough time getting a lot of that water out of there. So you want to do what's comfortable for your system.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. Another question was, if you're blowing out the system, where do you connect the air compressor?
Well, it depends on your particular system and the type of valve. If you have like what we call a stop and waste valve that has a drain on the side that sticks out, you can try it there, depending upon how accessible it is. I know that many people on what I call the downstream side, you know, that goes from the backflow to the valves, will have like a Zerk fitting. It's kind of like applying grease to a wheel axle that you'll be able to fit the compressor to on that. You know, they may have access at the sprinkler valves. You may need to get some help with that from a landscaper, from a plumber, irrigation specialist. Tell them what you need if you're not real handy with installing these things. But there's many, many remedies on this, but it's not always an easy thing to have. But once you have it installed, or for instance, the Zerk fittings are installed, you're good to go.
Thank you, Chuck. I have no more questions, and apologies for interrupting your segue there. I'll hold the questions until you're done.
We'll do some more questions here. Check your meter again, and if the low flow indicator is not moving, that means you did a successful job in winterizing. Your shutoff valve and everything is down snug. You don't have any leaks going on. Don't fret if you do see some movement. It doesn't mean that you did an incorrect job. It means that possibly some water has been left on again inside the house. Check to make sure somebody isn't using water in the house. If you've ruled out all of those possibilities, you may need to go to the supply valve, the shutoff valve again, and remanipulate or reoperate that, as sometimes you can get a little debris, a little grit, maybe some sand in there from the drain valve will not allow that to seal up completely. So what you would do is just open and close it, even just slightly, enough to kind of work any debris free, and then snug it down. Maybe try that 2 or 3 times. And many, many times that will resolve that problem. And that way you know if you are good to go in your winterization. The other thing is your actual timer We talked about this earlier, probably on the garage wall. Most of these have a dial on them, the set run times, zones and all that. Well, they'll all have, whether it's by button or a dial, they'll all have an off position, and you just turn it to off and you're good. That way it keeps the sprinkler valves from operating on and off all winter long. They're in freezing conditions. You don't really want those operating. Plus, water is a little bit of a lubricant, and it helps the valves function a little bit easier. Well, they're dry now. So kind of think about, do you want those operating on and off like you do all summer with water in there? So real simple process. Also, you may have a backup battery. Usually it's a 9-volt battery, unless it's a newer timer, which have permanent backup batteries in them. You might want to check your model, and if you think it's older than a year or two, just replace it. Right on there with a felt tip pin, the month and the year. Change it out every couple of years, because we get a lot of power failures here in Nevada. And even though it's plugged into the wall, if you have a power failure, there's no power going to this timer. Well, that backup battery will save the settings. It'll save you the hassle of having to go through and reset everything during spring startup. And it doesn't run the timer, but it just actually saves the settings in the timer. Okay. Another thing, keep in mind, go around the outside of your house, any faucets. This is a frost-free hose bib. This is what it looks like from my hand on the outside of your house. Make sure the hose is disconnected. This is a hollow tube. There's a rod going through here. Your actual valve is here inside the foundation where it's warmer. This will fill with water when you open it. Will come out of your nozzle to the hose. Well, when you turn it off, you want that water to drain out of there and have this dry so it doesn't freeze, because if it freezes with this water, it'll expand, it'll break it. That's why you want that hose off of there. Go around your hoses, dump the water out of those. Any other fixtures you may have, or like nozzles, sprinklers, pick them up, dump the water out, because it's all stuff that costs money. And if you have water in there and we get a hard freeze and it expands and breaks, well, you have to buy a new one. So just kind of think about that stuff as well.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm not sure. Another question came through was, do you have a connection for an air compressor, or do you hold the air, or do you just hold and chuck the air in the open slot?
Well, there's many, many different ways I have seen. My personal experience, I am able to access the drain valve on my shutoff valve. It's not in a sleeve, it's in a box. I have one of these systems, like many, many people have in the area. They're not normal like we're showing here. This is probably the most common example, but what I'm able to do is to take a piece of heavy duty tubing and hose clamp it onto the side of the drain on my shutoff valve. I take the air compressor, the one that blows the air to blow dust off the things. I'm able to put it onto that piece of hose and go from there, and I'm able to blow it out. And I actually blow it out through each sprinkler valve, and I keep that pressure to level, so I'm not blowing out the sprinkler valves. You might be able to actually unscrew the bleeder valves on the top of the sprinkler valve if it has them. Most do. And try and take the rubber tip nozzle on the compressor and try it that way to see if you can get air to go through and blow those peripheral lines out. So it's a little bit of trial by error, a little bit of, playing around with things to see what works, what doesn't work. Not everybody's going to have the easy answer. Again, as I talked about the Zerk fittings earlier, that's just another way to get air into the system and blow the system out.
Thank you, Chuck. Appreciate that. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm going to switch to the last page of this PowerPoint for the information for you all. And for you to note that I will forward this slide to those of you who attended today. Here you go, Chuck.
Anything we can do in conservation, let us know. Email us at the email address there, conservation@tumwa.com, or the conservation hotline of 834-8005. With the COVID situation, it's not staffed on a regular basis, so you may need to leave a message, but we do return phone calls, so try and be patient. But any questions, if you get stuck somewhere, you're really not sure what to do, we'll try our best to answer your question. If you need assistance in locating the meter, which is usually by the street, many times we can step you through finding the meter on the phone. There are going to be times where maybe we need to come out and show you how to safely remove the meter lid, how to access the meter, maybe how to read it. That's fine too. Just let us know and we'll do our best to help you out. Keep an eye on the temperatures. Typical Nevada weather, we just had a hard freeze. Now we're going to be back in the 70s, and then we'll probably have snow the following week. You just don't know, but good time of year to winterize. And if your plants, trees need some water, don't be afraid to use a hose and a sprinkler out there. Make sure you disconnect from the faucet when you're done, drain that water out. Lawns will be going dormant, so you probably won't have to worry too much about those. And just knock on wood that we do get a little moisture, and you won't have to worry about it till the spring.
Thank you, Chuck. I've had a couple of the attendees express their gratitude and appreciation for the presentation. You did a great job. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I will send out an email to you all with this PowerPoint presentation, and all this information on the last slide will be there for your reference. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Chuck, for a great presentation, and Robert, you all have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.